So my parents had me when my mum was 19 and my dad was about 16 or 17. My dad was heavily involved in gangs. My mum was using drugs, and she was also homeless for a period of time. So my dad was drinking alcohol, mum was using drugs, and that's kind of how I came into the world. My parents weren't fit to look after me, so they would often give me to their friends or church people or people that they knew while they partied or, did drugs or did whatever it is that they were doing at the time. And so I was passed around a lot between people. I was actually diagnosed with a mild form of cerebral palsy at this age because my mum would breastfeed me because she desperately wanted to. And what she was intaking, the drugs that she was taking into herself, were affecting her milk and were affecting me. My grandparents got a call from a social worker when I was 4 months old, saying that I was living in an environment that wasn't good for me. And so they drove down from Nelson to Christchurch to come and get me. At the time, my parents were partying, which they often did. My dad was drunken and angry and a bit of a rage. He didn't want that to happen, so he tried to, forcefully do everything he could to stop that from happening. And I was in a bad state. I was crying. I'm very upset as a baby, unsure what was happening. And they took me from there and took me back to Nelson. My grandparents got custody of me, and they took me to live with them in Nelson. And my mother, obviously distraught, would come up every now and again to visit, not very often, but I remember my grandfather telling me a story of one time that she came up and she took me for a walk. She said she was just going to take me for a walk, and she actually kidnapped me and took me back down to Christchurch with her. And of course she was down there with me for a while, and so by the time my grandparents came down to collect me again, I was sick again, and they had to bring me back up and kind of start the integration process of me being, part of their family all over again. My early memories of living with my grandparents are pretty hazy now, but I remember it being fun. Eventually, home life with my grandparents became kind of like a battlefield, or walking on eggshells. So their relationship started to decline, and as their relationship started to decline, so did their relationship with the rest of us. And so there was quite a lot of arguing, quite a lot of shouting, and around this time, I would have been around 6 years old. I was sexually abused by someone close to me, who was also a minor, and at the time, I don't recall feeling any kind of trauma from it. Actually, what makes it possibly sadder is that as a lonely child whose parents weren't around, I thought that this was a fun game, that we could play together, and that I would be included in, and that it meant that I was worth something. I didn't quite understand. This wasn't the only instance of this happening to me. I was sexually abused by another minor not long after this. From this point, my family life really started to deteriorate, not just the relationships around me, but myself. I became very angry, very reserved, very resentful. I hated everyone, but I also hated myself. And my family are Christians, but I saw the hypocrisy within my own family, and I didn't want anything to do with that kind of life. I didn't want to be anything like them. And so I kind of just spiraled down at such a young age into this just pool of hatred. My parents would often say, yeah, we'll come for your birthday, or hey, we're going to come up in a week, or hey, we'll go and do this together. And then they would often not show. And I think around this age, I came to realise that actually they were probably never going to come. And I think that was one of the catalysts for me, falling way deep down, because until this point, you have a childlike hope. You keep a hope that, maybe they'll come this time, maybe it'll happen this time. And it never did, and so eventually I just thought, it's never going to happen. And I feel like that was when hope just disappeared for me. So from the ages of 12 to 22, I tried to commit suicide on almost a yearly basis. I felt it was just a decade of just hating myself, hating everything I did. There would be moments of happiness, but they would soon be clouded by darkness, when I was left alone with my thoughts. And so I spent that decade really wishing that I didn't exist, was how that decade was spent for me. You get to this point where you're so far down in a hole that, you're trying to hurt yourself because you feel like you deserve to be hurt or you don't deserve to live. And then you're trying to hurt as many people around you as you possibly can. One, to see if they care, and two, because you really just want them to hurt you because you feel like you deserve to be hurt. When you burn a bridge or when you take something from someone and they're angry at you, you think, yes, good, be angry at me, don't like me, hurt me. It's kind of how it was. So at this point I'd moved back home and with my grandmother. My granddad and her had divorced. Decided eventually that I would start going to church again because I knew the people there and it was somewhat of a comfortable space even if I didn't share the views. But I remember one day in my room I was standing there and very clearly in my head, and I can still relive it now, I remember God just saying in my head, it's time to come home. And that was all he said. And I was just like, okay. And it was a really weird moment. Around this time when I had started going back to church kind of on and off, I lived with some church friends and they had a friend called Jamie, and he would come by our house, our flat in the morning and knock on my door and ask me constantly if I was coming to church. And it's not just one knock and like, are you coming to church? It was like, knock, knock, are you coming to church? Knock, knock, are you coming to church? Over and over again. And some mornings I would just ignore him, but then eventually I would just get annoyed and I would go anyway, and then it turned into a joyful experience. The people that this Jamie guy went to church with, he had a couple of close friends and they were really happy, joyful people. They would dance during praise and worship, which I thought was really weird. They would try and make me dance, which I found really annoying. And eventually it just became really infectious and the environment became joyful, and I found that I didn't need to wait for him to knock on my door anymore because I was already up and ready to go. The pastor and his wife that came in spoke about having a relationship with God, about how, we could speak to God, about how we could be with God. And I had never experienced that in my life. I didn't know that you could have a relationship with God. I didn't know that he loved me. I'd never been told those things growing up. Never once in my life until this point. I don't ever recall being told by my parents that Jesus loved me. So for me, as I came to know Jesus, he became my safe place. He became, if you picture a big fortress that's impenetrable, no one else can get in. Only you and Jesus can get in there. Finding my identity and my needs in him is what allows me to live in peace. I'm no longer chasing someone else. I'm no longer chasing people that let me down. I was very fortunate to come across people who believed in me, and I'm a firm believer that even if one person believes in you, that can make all the difference. And so when I contemplated forgiving my parents and forgiving other people that had hurt me, I took time to think back to their lives about, what they've been through. My dad didn't have a stable upbringing. My mum didn't have a stable upbringing. And their hurt and their trauma doesn't excuse how they treated me. But it helps me to forgive them, to know that they lived fractured lives as well, that actually the hurt that I have felt, and I know the hurt, they have felt it as well, but perhaps they just didn't have the tools or they didn't have the right people around them, like I was fortunate enough to have, to help them pull themselves out of those holes. We were always kind of taught, or I always perceived, that when you forgive someone, you have to forgive them and then forget about it. That's it. You forgive them and then you don't hurt anymore and you don't experience anymore, you don't think about it. But actually, for me, what I've realised is that forgiveness can sometimes be daily. Sometimes I have to wake up in the morning and say, hey, I just need to forgive this person again. Lord, I'm still willing, my heart is still open to forgiving them. And particularly around my parents, I think a lot of their hurt has come from unforgiveness to their own families, and I am a real believer that I want to break cycles, I don't want to make them. I want to make sure that my children don't have to carry the same pain and the same cycle that I have. During 2018, I lost 50 kgs and I started training to be a personal trainer. And so this year, my future goals are to once again lose weight and to finish my certification to become a personal trainer. And then I want to create a business that really focuses on physical and mental health. There's a book by John Ortberg and the book is called God is Closer Than You Think, and it has a quote in it by him that says, the central message of the Bible is not I will forgive you, it's I will be with you. And remembering, that God will be with us in everything really helps me every day, no matter what I'm going through.